I'm here at a very interesting point in the evolution of education in the United States and some other countries. That, in a way, when Nancy and I were at Reed, we imagined that this could happen, and we thought, well, how long could it take? Gosh, it might take 10, 20 years maybe. Who knew? Okay, it took a little longer than that. But we may be at a real turning point in the following regard. Ever since the beginning of education, whenever that began, probably cave people did education with their cave babies, education has proceeded entirely in the absence of evidence. It has proceeded in a circumstance in which decisions were made about educational programs and practices based on tradition, based on fads, based on policies, based on almost anything except for hard evidence. And as a result, in any field of endeavor in which that is the case, in which evidence plays a very minimal role, the progress takes place in the form of a pendulum, where something is in, and then after a while people get tired of it and it goes out, and you wait long enough, you can almost set your watch. It will be back in some other form. It will be back under some other name. And then it will go out, and it will come back again, and we make no progress, although we feel as though we're going somewhere. And that it has been the case for a very long time, and you can contrast it very much with the situation in fields such as medicine and agriculture and technology, engineering, all of which do pay a great deal of attention to evidence and therefore make consistent progress year by year. You can be confident that, not in every area and not in a smooth pattern, but you can be confident that 10 years from now, there will be better medical treatments for many diseases. You could be confident that 10 years from now, the productivity of agriculture in many areas will have improved, or the cost effectiveness, or that whatever objectives there are in agriculture will be better. And the reason you can be confident is not because you know anything about the particulars of which diseases or which cows or which seeds or which one thing or another are going to change, but because these programs, these areas of endeavor have a commitment to evidence, and because they have a commitment to evidence, people are working very hard throughout the world to try to create better and better solutions, knowing that these solutions will be put to the test, and if they are successful, they will be widely adopted, and this will make a difference and continue to move the field forward. Education has not been this way, but it is becoming this way to a much greater extent than was once the case. And what I'm going to be doing today is kind of telling you where things are right now in this regard, and telling this extraordinary story that we are literally in the middle of. The reason it's a particularly useful time or interesting time is that in December of 2015, the United States Congress, of all people, I mean the last people you would imagine to get together and do something sensible, did get together and do something sensible, got rid of No Child Left Behind, and replaced it with something called Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, which has all kinds of provisions in it. Nobody really knows what all the provisions are, but that among them has definitions of what it means to have a strong evidence base for a given program or practice, and consequences. Just a few, nothing too serious, but consequences in terms of, if you use those programs that do have a strong evidence of effectiveness, there are various circumstances in which you could get extra points on a grant application or otherwise have positive consequences for your school or district. And the implications of this are just beginning to form at this very moment. It could end up being a total bust. It could end up being something quite extraordinary. And that's the story I'm hoping to tell. All right, so here's a picture of one of our, you may recognize this guy. And here is a quote from a book that he wrote in which he lays out a basic principle of government that has not really been articulated before nearly as clearly, that he wanted to find those reforms in all fields that have the highest impact on achievement, fund them, and eliminate programs that do not produce results. That's pretty radical. If you said it about medicine, of course, it wouldn't be radical in the slightest. But to say it about education in particular is a radical statement. And he followed through on that idea, and not only in education, but in other fields as well that are going through a similar transition, where they didn't used to have evidence involved, and now they do. So, what's the concept here? School reform, ordinarily, is a story of churn, of ideas coming and going, of things that are changing just to change, or because a new political party comes into power locally or nationally. And so we see things that come and go. Accountability and assessment is always very controversial, and people are always doing different things with it. Whether these assessments and accountability strategies actually produce better achievement doesn't ever seem to enter into the conversation. People fling evidence back and forth at each other about that, but the evidence really comes after people's ideological beliefs. Similarly with governance for schools, such as charters and vouchers. There are people who believe in charters and vouchers. There are people who don't. There's evidence about the effectiveness of charters and vouchers, mostly negative. Doesn't make the slightest bit of difference. People are for or against them based on whatever their beliefs were before. Teacher evaluation, under Arne Duncan, there were teacher evaluation plans that were imposed upon teachers coast to coast that had not been piloted in a single school. Nobody knew what they were going to do, how they were going to work. When they were put into practice, they were generally disastrous. They were warned against by statisticians who said that basing teacher evaluation in part on the degree to which teachers were getting higher scores from their personal kids is something that statistically cannot be done. In secondary schools, you had situations in which math teachers would be considered the best teachers in their state in the fifth period and should be fired based on second period. Does this make any sense? I don't think so. But it prevailed because it was politically popular among certain people that were proposing it, and the evidence did not make any difference. You could name almost any issue, curricular issues, instructional issues, many, many kinds of things, in which evidence could be obtained, oftentimes does exist, but simply has not affected the debate in any consistent way. So, stop the pendulum. I want to get off, and I hope I can convince all of you that you would like to get off of that particular pendulum as well. And I mentioned this already, that in fashion, in areas that don't lend themselves to evidence, hemlines go up, hemlines go down, things become, in because they're in. And then, after a period of time, people get tired of them, and they change because they're old. They're no longer attractive. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and nearby was Silver Spring, Maryland, and it was loaded with Art Deco buildings, quite lovely Art Deco buildings. Except that when I was growing up, the appearance of Art Deco meant that something was old, and therefore it was ugly, and therefore it was torn down. Not because Art Deco wasn't lovely, but because it was old. It indicated that it was built a long time ago. And that's how fashion changes, is things go in and out. Obviously in art, things are the same, and in many, many other areas, change happens, but it happens not because things are better, but only because they are different. People get tired of the old way. So word of mouth is what causes changes in education. Tradition, politics, marketing, any number of things cause change, none of which have anything to do with the evidence of whether they are actually beneficial for children. This is what has to change. This fundamental dynamic here is susceptible to change. Outcomes in education can be measured. There's a reasonable discussion to be had about circumstances in which it's difficult to measure things and what's an adequate measure and things of that kind. But fundamentally, it is possible to measure educational outcomes and to be able to know what works and what does not, and to begin to make decisions based on that, and that will have consequences far beyond just simply identifying those programs that currently exist and then using them more, but rather changing the way the innovation enterprise operates in education. So what is evidence-based reform? As I mentioned earlier, it's modeled on other fields like medicine, agriculture, and engineering. And what it's intended to do is, as I was just saying, first off, to identify those things that already have good evidence of effectiveness and use them more. But more importantly, to create a dynamic in which you have innovators, philanthropy, government, school districts themselves, many, many people engaged in a process of creating things that they think are going to be more effective than what exists today. That dynamic is what will fundamentally change education to its core. Imagine, if you will, that America decided that it needed to be first in the world in algebra. The idea here is that you could specify what are the outcomes of algebra that you want, and you could specify them more broadly than the current standardized tests that are used, but you could have whatever measure you think is valid and meaningful. But you said that whichever programs are designed that are capable of being used broadly, replicated as often as you want, and that you would should you meet a high standard of evidence, that your algebra program would be widely adopted, so you could become wealthy if that's your goal, or famous if that's your goal, or whatever you like, but you could solve the heck out of algebra. The key concept, however, is that there's a standard that is not merely the standard of what looks good, but there's a standard of improving students' actual algebra performance. Now take that algebra example and use it to think about effective preschool programs, effective early reading programs, effective elementary science programs or math programs or whatever you need. Middle school science, math programs, social studies programs, writing programs, whichever area you can possibly imagine. There's nothing in all of education that cannot fundamentally be measured in terms of its outcomes, and you could identify those things that worked, and as soon as you did, the day after that happened, you would start an enterprise of development, evaluation, dissemination that is already well underway, by the way, under primarily federal funding, but you would greatly accelerate it because many other actors would get involved. A key analogy to this is what happened in medicine in 1964. In 1964, because of the thalidomide crisis, there was legislation that was passed in the U.S. Congress that required that medicines be proven safe and effective. And as a practical matter, what they meant was that they had to be subjected to randomized evaluations of a very high level of quality before they could be widely disseminated. There are graphs that you can see that show the amount of research activity in medicine, and it's the research activity is going along, and here is 1964. Wham! Until to this day, medical research throughout the world continues to accelerate at a dizzying pace. Why? Because there is respect for evidence, because everyone has a clear understanding that new medicines, new procedures, new things that actually can make a difference in the lives of people are worth investing in, both from a monetary perspective and in terms of an impact on people kinds of perspective. And therefore, drug companies invest in research, government invests in research, philanthropy invests in research, and a huge number of very talented researchers are working day and night on whatever issue there is to try to move forward practice and availability of solutions in medicine. This same thing happens in every field where this transition has taken place, and that's what I'm really talking about here in education. So imagine then that you had a circumstance like what I've essentially been describing. You have educators who are evaluating their needs and choosing among proven interventions. So that imagine, going back to my algebra example, that rather than talking to the rep from Pearson and the rep from Macmillan McGraw-Hill in order to decide what algebra text you should use, committees at school districts would be looking at the evidence on which algebra programs actually make a difference. And they would tell the Pearson reps when they called, they say, "Hey, I'm so glad to hear from you. Do you have any evidence for the programs that you want to show me?" And they say, "It wouldn't meet the standards of the What Works Clearinghouse or whatever." And you say, "Oh, okay, well, call me when you do." Click. Okay, nothing. People don't click anymore, but you know what I mean. But regardless of who creates a program, whether it uses technology, whether it doesn't use technology, whether it's professional development, whatever, you'd be choosing among programs and practices with strong evidence of effectiveness. This doesn't say you have to choose program X. Hopefully there would be many programs that you could choose among, and you could make that choice based on any number of attributes, a cost, or it could be because you like the philosophy or that you've heard that your buddy down the road used that program and they really liked it. But it doesn't matter as long as you have confidence that all of those programs are all proven to be effective. So this requires that you would have a variety of things in each area. That is building up. There have been substantial investments, particularly by the federal government, in the shelf, if you will, of educational programs. In particular, the Institute for Education Sciences, which is the main research agency in the Department of Education, has been funding this kind of research and development. And in the Obama administration, they created a new program, much larger, called I3 for Investing in Innovation, that has been funding large-scale development of new programs, third-party randomized evaluations of existing programs or new programs, and then dissemination of the programs that have been proven to work. All of these things have created progressively more and more proven solutions in many, many different fields, in beginning reading, in science, in mathematics, in social emotional learning, in many other areas. And so we're not there, we're not all the way there. We don't have solutions for absolutely everything, and we don't have enough solutions in many areas, but we're way, way, way beyond a starting point. We have a lot that's ready to go right now, and a lot that's nearly ready to go or will be fairly soon. Imagine now that you also had funding from the federal government or from local state governments that encourages the use of programs that have strong evidence of effectiveness. So that should you decide to use that algebra program, the government might say, you know, we're not telling you what to do. You don't have to use a proven program at all if you don't feel like it. But if you do, then here's a fund of money that we'll give you to help you pay the costs of adopting that new proven program. That actually is one of the things that is in the new ESSA legislation, where in the most clear form, they're requiring the use of programs in what's called school improvement grants. School improvement grants have been around for a long time, and it's kind of been an embarrassment, but these are schools, elementary and secondary schools, that are the worst schools in all of America. They're scoring in the lowest 5% of schools in their state, and they have for a long, long time. These are places that need the best we possibly have to offer them, and they need it right now, and they need it school-wide, not just in one subject or another. And up to now, these schools have been offered things that are horrible. They've been asked to make up their own programs locally, and the programs that they've made up have been very disorganized, and the outcomes have been embarrassingly bad. This new legislation is saying that we need a different approach. We need to be able to provide this additional funding for these schools in terrible shape, but it needs to be focused on things that have been proven to work, things that are known to make a substantial difference in the outcomes that we're looking for. So it's one example of how government could say, we're not telling you what programs to use. You have a broad range of things that you might choose, but we want to see that whatever you do choose, show us some evidence that this thing has been evaluated in high quality, preferably randomized, it doesn't require randomized, but preferably randomized experiments, and found to be effective on the kinds of measures that are considered valid for the outcomes that you're looking for, primarily reading and math in this case. In 7 other areas of this education bill, there are incentives. These are situations in which schools or districts can apply for money from the federal government, and the government says, we're not saying you'd have to use proven programs at all, but we're saying that we'll give you some extra points on your application if you choose to do so. So if you can bring forward evidence to show that a given program that you're adopting is been proven to make a difference, then you could earn additional points based on the quality of that evidence. Now, it's important to understand what we're talking about here, and there are a number of things that kind of sound like evidence-based practice, but are not. First off, we're absolutely positively not talking about top-down mandating of practices that are, quote, supported by research. Educators, this is a little-known fact, but educators are human beings. And human beings hate to be told what to do. They like to have choice. They like to have agency. And in the case of education, buying an educational program is not like buying a pill, as it might be in medicine. It's not like buying a thing, and you buy it, and the fact of buying it is all you have to do. In education, things need to be implemented. And the chances are pretty slim that you're going to implement something very well if it's been forced down your throat, let's be honest. So it's very important that government, again, be it federal, state, local, entice people to use proven programs, but do not force them to do so, and that when they do, even when they entice, that they offer a variety of possibilities, so that people can say, all right, I understand why it's in the interests of children and the interests, and therefore government, to highlight programs with strong evidence of effectiveness, but we still get to make a choice. Our local, we have our local needs, we have our local, politics and situation. Fine, that's good. But there's a reason for us to use something that has strong evidence of effectiveness and is ready to go. A second is that we're not talking here about providing teachers, individual teachers, with general principles that are supported by research. Now, I write an educational psychology text, and it's loaded with general principles intended for teachers that help teachers to conceptualize the task that they have as teachers and to do as good a job as possible with that information. So I'm not saying that those principles are not useful for teachers to have. They're very useful for teachers to have. But general principles are not at all the same as proven programs. General principles help teachers to conceptualize what they're trying to do, and they give them hints, and but they're too small to make a huge difference. They're very much reinterpreted by individual teachers, and so government really doesn't have a role in terms of saying you have to wait 3 seconds to give kids feedback on their answers, or you have to do this kind of grouping of children for instruction, or you have to any number of kinds of things that are not programs and they're not big stuff, but that are equally important. But so those kinds of things can go along pretty much the way they have. What we're talking about here is the point at which a school says, okay, we need a new approach to middle school science. What we've been doing is just not that good in middle school science. We need a whole approach to middle school science. Let's pick something that has been proven to improve performance in middle school science, if that's what we're after. Or our kids are not getting to third grade reading in adequate shape. We need to do something about that. What are the programs and practices that have been proven to get you to third grade reading successfully at a very high level in, let's say, in schools where reading would be a difficulty? So we're talking in general about things that are at the level of schools or at the level of departments that are beyond the range of what an individual teacher does. that are supported by research. Another is that we're not talking about having educators become researchers themselves. That's welcome. It's wonderful if teachers do become researchers, but the kinds of research designs that we're talking about here are far, far beyond what individual teachers or schools can do on their own. Just to give you a picture of what I'm talking about here, usually programs of this kind are evaluated in studies where 40 to 50 schools are assigned at random to use a given program or to continue doing what they have been doing. It's simply not possible to do these kinds of giant studies that are required to get valid information evaluating school-level programs that are done at a very small level by local folks. Oftentimes, teachers and small groups of teachers or small groups of schools can have terrific ideas and create something that then can work their way up the line in terms of becoming evaluated and can be of enormous impact eventually. But it's not the kind of thing we're talking about where a teacher says, I got a great idea and my idea is as good as anybody else's idea, and I tried it out and my kids did better than they used to do. That's not the kind of research that is going to qualify under this kind of circumstance. It's going to be much larger and more technically difficult than that, if you really want to be able to put a lot of reliance on it. And similarly, you're asking each school to invent its own research-informed methods. Again, schools are always free to invent their own research-informed methods if they want to, and that's a fine thing to do. If you're a group of teachers or you are a principal and you want to use research-informed methods, then go to it. But it's not what we're talking about here, because what you do in that circumstance is you may be making terrific choices, but you're not creating something new that then has been evaluated and found to be effective. Again, it could be a first step in that direction, but it's not the whole process. Now, there are a number of things that are going on that are moving in this direction. I think I've mentioned maybe all of them already, but here's a convenient list. I've already mentioned the ESSA standards of evidence. This is extremely important. This has never been true anywhere in the world, that anybody has ever defined what it means to have strong evidence of effectiveness. Actually, in ESSA, there are 3 levels that count. One is called strong evidence of effectiveness, which is where you have at least one study that in which schools or classrooms were randomly assigned to use a given program and compared to a control group that was randomly assigned to keep doing what they were doing over a period of at least a year and found to do better on an accepted measure of the outcome. So if you have done that and the schools were assigned at random, then you qualify for the strong criterion under ESSA. There's a second level that's called moderate, which is exactly the same as what I just said, except it's quasi-experimental. And what quasi-experimental means is that you have a group of schools that's designated non-randomly to use the program and another group of schools that serves as a control group. You've got measures that indicate that the two groups of schools are very, very similar in terms of prior achievement, in terms of demographics, in terms of other kinds of factors, so that you're pretty confident that the experimental and control schools are quite similar before the program began. And then you look to see whether the outcomes are better in the group that's using the experimental program. So that's called moderate, exactly the same as the randomized except for the randomization. The third is something called promising, which means that there's a correlational study. So a correlational study could mean that you have schools that are already using a given program and you're finding other schools that are not, and you're making a comparison between the schools, controlling for prior achievement and other factors. I have to say that in my own lobbying efforts and those of many others that I've been working with, we tried to fight against this one. This is not a really terrific research design, but politics won, and it is included in the list. But nevertheless, having these definitions gives people who do care about evidence a basis for saying, okay, I'd like to start wherever we can to pick programs that are as high on that list as possible so that we can move forward our kids in line with what ESSA is suggesting. There may be an incentive for it, there may not be, but at least we're clear about what we're trying to achieve in improving, using evidence and data to improve outcomes. Okay, so I guess I already talked about these elements of the ESSA standards. Okay, and I already talked about some of the consequences in ESSA for using these programs, but I think that one of the things that beyond the specific provisions is that throughout the legislation, ESSA is encouraging the use of proven programs, and if the Department of Education follows this up as they say they will, then it will become something that at least people are buzzing about. Something that will be considered when people are making decisions about what programs and practices to use in their schools, particularly for the children who are most vulnerable. Evidence generally comes from schools that are the most impoverished schools that are experiencing difficulty, and federal policy generally applies particularly to those schools. So where this is most likely to make a difference is in high poverty schools, rural, urban, wherever they happen to be, and so ESSA will particularly encourage the use of proven programs in places where the need for them is deemed to be the greatest. Investing in innovation that I mentioned, the I3 program is the largest effort in education that's ever taken place. I should tell you, this is extraordinary. They have spent $1.5 billion so far on development and evaluation of programs in all different areas from preschool through 12th grade. I was talking to a reporter from the New York Times about this and just, carrying on about how exciting and wonderful this all was and unprecedented, and she was just kind of silent for a while. And I said, what's the matter? And she said, well, I usually write about medicine, and what you're talking about is chump change. This is, it's for education, it's beyond human imagining that anybody would invest this much. But in medicine, that's not so much. But the great thing about education is that medicine has to cure an awful lot of diseases. We only have to cure one disease, ignorance. Once we start learning how to solve some of the enduring problems that we have in education, a lot of those solutions will generalize to, if you find solutions for algebra, I'm willing to bet that they will also work for Math 7, and they'll also work for trigonometry, or with appropriate adaptations to a degree that they might not generalize so much in medicine. So the possibilities of real breakthroughs, I think, are particularly large as we get going. In any case, so I3 has been investing money, and they're using something that was invented for I3 and now has extended into other fields, which is called tiered evidence standards, which means that if you have no evidence at all, you get a little bit of money to develop your program. Okay, a little bit of money could be $3 million, which in education terms is a lot of money, a lot of little bit of money. If you already have some evidence, like a single study supporting your program, but you need further evidence, you can get what's called a validation grant, where a third-party evaluator evaluates your program, and you might get $15 million to do that, which in again, in education terms, is like, whoa! Okay, now it's down to $12 million, but it's still a really big amount of money. And if you already have large-scale randomized experiments behind your program, and so it's really proven to work already, you can get what's called a scale-up program, a scale-up funding, which at the moment is $20 million. Luckily, we got one for Success for All a few years ago when the amount of money available for those things was $50 million. Oh, those were the days. But the idea was that at that stage, you still had to have a third-party randomized large-scale evaluation done on your program, but otherwise, most of the money was supposed to go to help you scale up, to help you disseminate proven programs. So this is continuing under ESSA and will continue to move forward, but the concept here is really important, that you can move up the line. If you start with a good idea, you prove that it can work, that you can get some evidence for it. You can have a third-party evaluation later on. If it works out, you can have it get support to disseminate it. Nothing like that has ever existed in education, for sure. The Institute for Education Sciences, I mentioned, has been doing work that's very similar to what I3 does, but on a smaller scale, and also does more theoretical work. It's more likely to be done by universities, but otherwise very similar tiered amounts of money depending on the quality of evidence that you already have. In England, there's something called the Education Endowment Foundation, very much patterned on I3, where there were some friends of mine who were sitting around minding their own business, and the new conservative government, mind the word conservative, laid 125 million pounds on them and said, here, use this over the next 15 years to develop and evaluate programs for England's schools. And they've been chugging away doing fantastic work, creating a whole bunch of models, and every one of them that works can readily be brought over to the U.S. and vice versa. Some of the programs that they're evaluating there are U.S. programs. Now, there are pitfalls to this. As this effort becomes known in the education world, there's a lot of concern that there will be too few effective programs. Many programs, as is true of medicine, the majority of programs that get evaluated fail. And we have to get over that. It's okay. We learn from the failed evaluations too, but one of the things that we learn is about those that do succeed are what matters. And we can't be discouraged by the fact that many of the things that we had great hopes for didn't work out. That's just part of the process. It's something that's a kind of a dirty secret of research, is that the vast majority of things in certainly human areas and medicine and other areas fail when they're subjected to large-scale evaluation. But it's not the number that fail, it's the number that succeed that move you forward in the short term, even as we learn from the things that don't work out as we wish they did. But there are also things that succeed but don't go to scale. Sometimes it's because we have university professors that made them and they don't really feel like going to scale. That's like business. That's not fun. That doesn't get them any publications or make them famous or anything like that. And so there are some things that are never tried to go to scale, or they may be created by a local school district that just wants it for themselves, but they don't really want to disseminate it to any other places beyond themselves. So that's another problem. There are disagreements about research methods, although that's calming down a great deal. And certainly there are legitimate discussions about what kinds of measures should count and that sort of thing. But those seem like solvable problems. What's really important is creating the political will and the intention, the excitement at the level of schools and districts and in the world of practice about using proven programs. So here's a vision for the future, an attainable vision for the future. So imagine now, as I have said before, that you've got teachers and administrators choosing among proven programs and practices. I write a weekly blog for the Huffington Post, which you might want to check out. It's kind of amusing, at least. It's always on evidence in education. And today's actual blog, today's Thursday, right? So today's actual blog was about Sears catalog. And I think it's a nice image here. When I was in high school, I had a job delivering Sears catalogs in the Maryland suburbs of Washington, and completely ruining my mother's 1960 Chevy station wagon. And one of the things that was great about this job, though, was that everybody was so glad to see me, because the Sears catalog was cool. It had all kinds of possibilities in it. And people would just open up the catalog and start, paging through it, looking at all the, it was a book full of dreams. All right, kind of consumerist dreams, but there you are. And because we didn't have any internet back then, so how do you dream without the internet? It's impossible. But imagine that you married the Sears catalog with Consumer Reports. So now you look at the thing and it says, here's a washing machine. You go, oh, could I use a great washing machine? That's really cool. Ooh, but the repair record is awful for this thing. Or it doesn't get clothes clean. So let me look at another one. Or whatever the product might have been. Imagine that you got your Sears catalog and it gave you that same appealing information about all the wonderful things you could do in your school. I'm now transitioning back to school. It gave you that same set of visions, of possibilities of what you could do in your school, described them in appealing ways, and gave you the information about what the evidence base is for those things so that you can make wise choices for your children. Whatever the government is doing in terms of incentives or whatever, you are the steward. If you're a school leader or a teacher or a superintendent, you are the steward of the educational development of your children. So you should want to know what the evidence base is and have it summarized in a useful and trustable kind of way. That is what is needed in education, just as it was needed in Sears catalogs years ago, is a way to get access to that kind of information so that teachers and administrators could be sitting around and going through these very colorful Sears catalog kinds of things and finding the things that make most sense to their particular place. Second, there would be a robust research and development enterprise that would be constantly developing and disseminating new programs. One of the things that I'm hoping would happen, and that certainly happens in medicine and agriculture, is that the front-end development that creates things that you can actually use, that actually save lives or give you better cows, also justify a great deal of basic research on the back end that people don't even read about in the newspaper. They're just, but they're going on because they feed into a process of research and develop. Did I just kill my? Okay, I probably did that the other. Okay, so that that it could help support the entire sequence, all the way from basic research to application and dissemination, and build some respect for research in the world of education. Let me tell you, being an education researcher, we get no respect. We need, groupies and, all right, never mind the groupies part. But to get some respect for the entire enterprise, I think would be very important. You could create networks of schools that are using similar programs and that therefore could share their wisdom of practice based on using that approach. so that you could link them electronically. You could have conferences at which people come and share the best practices that they're doing. And what would be different from what happens now is that people would have a common language. People would be able to discuss, I'm using that same algebra program that you're using. Did you have this problem? Yeah, we had that problem too. And let me show you what we did with that, whether in person or not. And it would create a different dynamic in terms of funding of education because, in a sense, education always gets the crumbs from the table because it's seen as something that has to do with children, women, people that don't usually get a lot of investment. Because even though people theoretically can see how education contributes to the economy, some big manly things like economy, they don't really see that connection very clearly. If they could see how investment in proven programs and investment in the research that continuously produces proven programs actually makes a difference in outcomes so that you're progressively expecting that things will be better, that you'll have the same confidence as we do in medicine, that 10 years from now, educational outcomes will be much better than they are right now because of the research, then our political leaders might be more willing to put up serious money for that entire process, including for the implementation and for the education at all. Okay, that's a little dreaming. So basically, that's my story. I'm sticking to it. It may not be the craziest thing you'll hear tonight if you stick for Dr. Demento, I guess. But let me stop here and see if you have any questions.